Welcome to A Case for America. This is Austin Hepworth. I'm here along with Michael Hepworth, and we are excited to be back today to talk to you more about the Constitution and how we feel America is a great nation, a place that's come really far and helped shape our whole world. To us, the Constitution is a model. It was a light to the world, and once the world saw that it worked, that it produced the ability for individuals to pursue their own destiny, you could say. People all over the world wanted it, and there were revolutions the world over to overthrow kings, and eventually constitutions were adopted by many countries. And some people have referred to the Constitution as America's greatest export because of how influential it's been. Now, again, we don't pretend like everything was perfect when America started. It was pulling out of a very it was coming on the hills of the Dark Ages. Wasn't quite the Dark Ages, but following out of that time. And there was still a lot of work to do. We believe, though, the Constitution set the stage for a lot of this work, and that people followed through with it, that people fought for continued improvements and good things. So with that, we're looking at the 15th Amendment that comes on the heels of the Civil War. It's passed a few years after the Civil War ends. It wasn't immediate. And the 15th Amendment comes to us following the 13th and 14th Amendments. And the 15th Amendment was addressing a very specific issue in America at the time. And it says, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state. So this amendment is very express that it applies to the United States and to any state. And so it says it shall not be denied or abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And then section 2 says the Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So it's one of the constitutional amendments that specifically grants power to Congress. And in my opinion, one of the things that's doing is it's saying the federal government has the power to tell the states certain things related to voting and race, color, previous conditions of servitude, because the amendment says no state can deny this and Congress has the power to enforce it. So it is, you could say it's something that adds to the list that Congress can vote on or pass laws about. The Constitution gives limits on what the federal government can do. And something like this would expand that slightly to say you can also legislate on these issues. So in America, if you look at the history of it, and we look at voting, after the Civil War ended, and this amendment came to be, there were past slaves or Black individuals that ran for government positions. And in the South, there were a number of them voted in. Now, likely, there was still, we don't know entirely whether it was still 100% racist or not, but most likely some of those people got in because of having districts that also had a lot of Black people in them. And again, I'm just speaking to the historical time. And so this created frustration for many states. And what started happening, instead of expressly banning someone because of their race or color from voting, they started passing laws that made it more difficult for certain people to be able to vote, or certain groups of people. And so, for example, they instituted poll taxes that said you had to pay a certain amount of money or taxes or different things in order to vote. That was later taken away, where the U.S. did away with those. But they had poll taxes, they had literacy tests, they would impose different requirements that they felt their preferred group could qualify for or get through, but that the unpreferred group couldn't. And these became very widespread in America. So eventually Congress passed legislation trying to do away with a number of these things. And it's interesting, in America today, we still find ourselves in a battle related to claims that certain governments or certain representatives or certain parties are trying to exclude others from voting. Now, it's not always race-based, but certainly we have an ongoing issue in America where we're not really settled on how fair our voting process is entirely. And we're not talking about whether or not, an election's stolen or whatnot. We're talking about who it is that gets to vote for a representative. Because if we look at the Constitution, Section 4 of Article 1 of the Constitution states, the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. But then it says, but the Congress may anytime by law make or alter such regulations. So traditionally, the House of Representatives in Congress is a body of individuals that are apportioned kind of approximate to population. There's supposed to be about one rep for every so many hundreds of thousands of people in the US. And that number grows over time because the population of America grows, but they chose at some point to cap the number of representatives. And so as the population grows, more people are voting for a representative. Now, the number of representatives per state in the House of Representatives is set up by the census. The Constitution said a census was supposed to take place every 10 years. So America does that census, and then they tell the states, oh, you've got this many people. This is how you fare compared to overall America. You get this many representatives, essentially. And states can either gain some seats or lose some seats in the House of Representatives based on how the census numbers shake out. I know Utah, I think it was in the 2010 census, gained a new seat in the House of Representatives. They went from 3 to 4 because of population growth. And so when it comes to the House, the issue still is alive in America about this exclusion of people from voting. Well, sorry, I'm saying this wrong. It's not exclusion of people from voting. It's exclusion of people from being able to vote for someone that represents them. Because maps, it's alleged, get drawn to split up certain groups of people so that their voice gets diluted in comparison to the other people that they're in a district with. So if Utah's split up into 4 districts, they're voting for 4 Utah House of Representative members. Everybody can go vote that registers in Utah. But the question is, will there ever be a Democrat that gets voted into the House of Representatives in Utah? There's enough people in Utah to vote Democrat. Over 25% of Utah would vote Democrat in some elections. But if they're not in a body in their own district, they may never get to elect a Democrat representative for them. And so it's interesting to see the 15th Amendment came in, and it made it so that, again, we eliminated a lot of the direct means of exclusion from being able to vote or to have representatives that share your values. But the issues still exist as to the indirect side of it. So we wanted to just show a couple of quick examples of what people are talking about when they talk about districts being drawn in a way that makes it so they can't elect one of their representatives. So if you're at least joining us on a video on YouTube, you can see this is Ohio, District 3 in 2013. And it's fairly disjointed. It's got, little tiny connections where something touches and, maybe just a street even, and then it loops on around, it circles back. And you can see how areas are really being carefully split up. Now, I would imagine this takes an incredibly long time to go through and draw these things. I don't know who does that. I've never talked to someone that's involved with that. But you can look and you can see towards the south part, especially, some very narrow lines connecting to other areas that then circle back towards the main body but never quite reach it. We can go to one in Illinois. This is in Chicago, where it shoots out. It's kind of a narrow, thin strip to the left, and then it goes down, and it looks like literally just a street. It takes maybe even a highway, follows that for a second, and then breaks off into another district down further south in it. And there's another little tiny one that comes off in the middle, shoots in, and just takes a little neighborhood. And what people allege with things like this is that these little pieces that shoot off and take pieces, they're taking in either Democrats or Republicans or different groups that they don't want to have a voice and breaking them up. Because one of the interesting things about the way we live in America is like tends to attract like. And so it's common for some cities to be more heavily weighted towards one race or culture than other cities. And so if you look at these maps, sometimes they come in and split up certain cities and get pretty aggressive about that. One pretty wild one, and if you're listening to this on Spotify and you can't see these, it's worth at least Googling gerrymandered maps and looking at some of the images that come up. But this one's been joked to be Goofy kicking, and it looks like a little outline of Goofy, in the air kicking something. And it's pretty wild how many little tiny connections there are, just kind of all over the place, going to different parts of the city. And so some people point to this and say we've got this horrible problem. Some people allege America is still racist because they're trying to split up certain ethnic groups' votes. But we also want to point out certain things. So this map here, if you look at Utah's current map since 2023 for federal district, some are much bigger than others, but Utah's population is not distributed proportionally at all. Almost half of the state's population lives in Salt Lake, just this little area here. And so all 4 districts have to come into Salt Lake to take some of it, because you can't just put that Salt Lake into one district. There wouldn't be enough population to go into the other 3. So they come in, but then they each go out to different corners of the state. And one thing to know is these counties down here in southern Utah are very, very low population. And so they can be big areas, but they take them in. Utah's map actually follows county lines pretty well, except for whenever it comes into Salt Lake, and a little bit in district number 4 in the middle, where there's a little bit more population as well. If you look at Indiana, its congressional maps since 2023, Indiana's mostly follow counties. There's a few deviations from that. You can see in District 9, there's a cut across the county. District 7 is Indianapolis, so again, it can't take in all of Indianapolis, has to split it up some. There's a little bit in District 4 that goes along county lines, and District 1 and 2 and 3 have a little bit. But for the most part, pretty clean lines, much cleaner than those other ones we looked at. And so the claim of gerrymandering is certainly not something you can apply across the board to every group. And it's also one that doesn't necessarily apply to every single group. Just because something may have been gerrymandered doesn't mean they were trying to exclude Chinese people or Black people or Christians. Maybe they were, but maybe it was the Democrats drawing lines to keep Republicans out of office. Maybe it was Republicans drawing lines to keep Democrats out of office. And that's always a burning question. because in Utah, there's enough people to vote Democrat. And if you put them all in a district together, we would have a federal House of Representative that's a Democrat. But we currently have 4 Republicans serving in the House of Representatives here. And the districts are drawn by Republicans. And certainly when they come into Salt Lake and split up the vote, they're also splitting up the Democrat vote and kind of putting it out across these other districts. So we just wanted to give you kind of a quick overview of where some of these issues still percolate. And Michael, I'm curious what your thoughts are on gerrymandering, claims of gerrymandering, and just kind of the fairness side of it. If you think it's appropriate that governing parties draw their own districts, or what your thoughts are on if there's a better way.
Yeah, I like how you pointed out that it's not enough to just look at it and then surmise that there's some sort of racism going on, or maybe there's a problem and there's not. We do need to make sure we understand the whole context of the situation. How is the population distributed? Was somebody distributing or discriminating against the race, or and this doesn't necessarily make it better, but it helps us understand the question a little bit. If a Republican or a Democrat or a member of their party wants to stay in power, they're incentivized to split up the votes of the other party. And so if they draw congressional lines that split up the votes of another party, their only intention may have been to maintain power for themselves. You could then look at that and say, well, look, it divides this particular group, cultural group, skin color, race, whatever, and then surmise that it was then racist. It's just kind of a reminder to be cautious in how we label things. It's not saying that, hey, we should just draw lines however we want. It's not an excuse for doing it. But to label it immediately as racist isn't right either. And to understand the whole process helps us have better, more intelligent conversations so that we can come to better understanding about what's going on. The question of how to draw them is a tough one. Generally, we look at representation geographically. So we, instead of saying at the federal level, how about all the registered Democrats get together and vote and all the registered Republicans get together and vote, and we'll split up reps based on the number of Democrats and the number of Republicans. We don't do that. We say rather go to the states set up how they're going to vote. And so it's at the very onset, it's split up geographically down to the state level. We don't let all the Democrats in the U.S. get together and all the Republicans in the U.S. get together. We split it up geographically by state. And if you look at the way state boundaries are drawn on the east end of the United States, a lot of small states, a lot of really funny lines in some places. Some of those states, cities in those states end up just kind of being suburbs of bigger cities in other states. And you wonder why they get lumped in with their state rather than with the city that most of the people work in. And the west side, it's a little easier because the states are larger and there's not as many cities in one state that are a suburb of another city in another state. But these are very difficult questions to answer. How should we actually split up how voting works? We've decided to go down to the state. Most people feel pretty good about that, unless you're on the east side of Oregon and you feel like you have more in common with the people in Idaho than you do with the people on the west side of Oregon. They feel like maybe we should be voting with the people in Idaho. So I think these are serious questions we should be discussing, and maybe keep in mind that maybe there's no absolutely great solution. We try to drill down to smaller and smaller levels to get the best result we can. I don't know that there's ever a perfect result. There's always trade-offs. In organization, we may say, let's go down to the states and let the states figure out how to draw these lines. They're going to be able to better apportion population than we would at a federal level. The lines might look really funny if they were drawn at a federal level, and there'd still be complaints about how they're drawn. That doesn't mean that we can't go to the states and say, is this representing kind of population, or is this representing political desire, essentially? And to your point of, if the political party in power draws it, is it more likely that they're incentivized to draw lines that favor their political party. And I don't think that's hard to understand. I think most people, if they're in the position, you're going to be tempted, hey, if I draw a line here or here, and here benefits me and my party, and if I feel like my party represents my moral values the best, and it's going to push my moral agenda the best, I almost feel a moral compulsion to put a line in a certain place. This isn't justification. This is just kind of talking through maybe what's going through people's minds as they're drawing some of these lines. Now, some of it gets absolutely nuts, but when we develop a good process where we're talking to each other about how lines are drawn, and maybe there's bipartisan efforts to draw lines to try to help dispel I'm going to favor my party more than the other party, or favor my interests more than the interest of the other side.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point to say maybe there's no truly good solution. Maybe one reason these issues still percolate is because no matter what, if you put a line in the sand, it'll be unfair. Just it's going to be unfair to someone. And I like your point about even looking at state lines. They're kind of crazy. I even look at Idaho. I've always wondered why Idaho just has this little chimney or whatever shooting up. It's just got this little narrow neck of land that shoots up. And you look at Montana, it's got pretty big borders. I've always wondered, I should probably look this up, but I've always wondered if the states got bigger as they went west, because I think that states had to have a certain population in order to get admitted to the US as a state. And so I think the boundaries became bigger and bigger, trying to get the population necessary. It's just my guess. But like you say, on the East Coast, some states have some funny lines. And why does Florida get this little, piece that juts out? And then you break it down, counties, states make their counties. How did they do that? I don't know. Indiana's got some very square counties. Other states have very unique looking counties. But then even break it down to cities. If you look at city maps, cities often start somewhere and then they can annex property and bring more property into the city as developments and things occur. And so sometimes cities start to compete, and you'll get some really odd shaped cities that come around and circle other cities and do different pieces because they won the annexation race or whatever. And it's not entirely fair because you can be in one place and you can't vote for, maybe a mayor that's impacting a lot of what's happening, but just because you live close to the boundaries, but you're not actually there. And so these are all considerations to talk about of, and even as cities, could cities have been racist potentially in how they chose to annex and not annex? Possibly. And I'm not here to say it's not an issue or to sweep it under the rug. It's more to say, though, that we do have to have a process for drawing lines, and then we just kind of have to live with it, because, and that isn't to say that you can't ever have a challenge to it or something if they're not following the rules, but at some point we have to stop arguing about lines if we've agreed on a process. Now, I don't think America's agreed on a process for how to draw lines. I don't think we're there yet. And I know in Utah there was some citizen referendum that passed a new gerrymandering bill. And that bill may have been one reason why Utah's current 4 congressional districts are a little bit more square in Salt Lake. They used to curve around more and carve neighborhoods out a little bit more than they do. But that one really pushed to require straighter lines for districts where you weren't going in and pulling from neighborhoods and things. They pushed roads as natural boundaries or streams as natural boundaries to districts instead of, oh, we just got these 4 homes here. But again, even there, I live at a place where, and just looking at the people I go to church with who are all in a local geographic area, there's 3 or 4 districts that split really close. I'm just at the line for a fair number of them. And so neighbors you talk with will be voting for different people that I'm voting for. And yeah, it is interesting again to go, how are these things drawn? One of the ways I've thought we might be able to just help in the process of answering some of these questions is just to require full disclosure of the people at work on drawing these lines. What were they told to draw the lines for? Were they told to draw the lines to carve out Democrats? Well, let's just put it on the record. I have no problem saying, let's just put it on the record. Anyone working on this, you have to disclose every direction given to you, every email, every text that comes through. It's just public data, and the public gets to see it and gets to see how these things are being drawn. And maybe the public's fine that they're drawn to support their favored party. Maybe they're not. But I look at solving this problem as maybe just saying, how come I have no idea where these maps come from? They just appear, and let's just shine some light on that. Let's really just have disclosure process, because this is a public thing. It affects us all. And I would personally be a huge fan of requiring disclosure of all communications to those working on drawing these maps. Because when you look at some of them, people were told to accomplish a certain goal. And you just say, just tell us what that goal is, make it public. And I think that would get rid of so many of the issues, or maybe it would compound them if there was nefarious things going on and people are, splitting out on nefarious things. But I feel a lot of these issues can be solved through transparency. And why not push for transparency and redistricting? Just to say, anyone that works on this, everything's open. Everything related to it's open. You got to just disclose it all. And I believe strongly in the power of light, the power of knowledge and disclosure to help alleviate a lot of these issues. But still, we'll be left with some funny shaped things. Some places it's just impossible not to, as you try and divide up the population. But one other thing that comes up as we talk about voting, this one's actually more related to voting than it is to representation. And that is whether or not you can require a driver's license if someone wants to go vote, or some form of identification. Can you make people provide proof they are who they are if they're going to vote? Now, I've heard some people talking about how there needs to be some kind of citizen test or something to get a right to vote. But curious, Michael, to know your thoughts on voting identification qualifications. Where should America, or maybe what are some principles America should think about in relation to those questions?
Yeah, when I hear these conversations a lot, I feel like people don't start at the very beginning and at least find something to agree on. I think you can ask the question, should there be some sort of requirement for identification to be able to vote? And by that, I mean, you imagine a vote for any federal or state or local rep where anybody who walked in the door could cast a vote and it would be counted. So take a local vote. Well, let's take a state vote. If you have a smaller state on the East Coast voting for their state legislature, people to go there, or their governor, and there's a neighboring state that has a lot of vested interest in your state because you have cities that are really close, people are in and out all the time, can all those individuals from that state walk over to your state and cast the vote for the governor they want or the state rep that they want? And how would you feel about that? At a federal level, could other countries just ship people over to America, temporary visas, whatever the case, whenever a vote happens, and just have them vote however they felt they wanted them to vote? I think most people agree that you should only be voting for those who are representing you. So as a member of the United States of America, you're voting for federal reps who represent you, or for the president. But if you're from another country, you shouldn't be able to vote. Some people might say that, well, if you live here, maybe you're not a citizen, but if you live here, you should be able to vote. And we can talk about those kinds of things. But for the most part, I think people would say you can't just show up in America for a day, cast a vote, and then leave. That doesn't seem to make any sense. So if we agree on that there should be some ability to say, this is your rep, then we should be able to say, how can we know that you should be able to vote then? So what kind of test is a fair test? People default to driver's license because it's easy. Once you turn a certain age, it's quite common to go out and get one. Some people say maybe it shouldn't be driver's license. You end up having to pay for it, or you have to take an exam to get it. And so there's a barrier to entry in some respects there. Some people say you can use social security cards. Those don't have pictures on them. They're easily forged. And you can just hand the social security card to somebody else if you want them to vote. So I think you have to start with the place of, do we think there should be some sort of test on, are you eligible to vote? Are you old enough? Are you a member of this voting group, this state, this city, this country? Or have you met whatever requirements we've set up? There should be some sort of indicator for that. And then we can talk about what it might be. I think it's important to note that as soon as you say there should be some sort of indicator, you immediately become exclusive to anybody who doesn't have that indicator. People don't like to think of excluding people from voting, but it's kind of that line in the sand you talked about before. As soon as you draw a line in the sand, there will be two different parties, those who can and those who can't. If you've created a test to vote, then you've created people that won't pass the test. So the question should be, is it restricting on grounds like, if we go back to the 15th Amendment, is it restricting people on the basis of race and color? Well, the 15th Amendment says you can't do that. That's easily thrown out. Are we hiding that fact through other means? Are we saying that most people of this race or this color tend to do this kind of thing? So, for example, let's say that there's a group of people that don't drink alcohol. We say this never happened, but you can only vote if you drink alcohol, and the test to vote is to come in and drink some alcohol. And immediately you've just excluded all these people that don't drink alcohol. Is that fair? Is that not fair? Those are I think the questions we should be talking about, not is it okay to exclude? I think we all agree it's okay to exclude. We just need to figure out who we're excluding and the best way to create a test to verify that you are eligible to vote for whoever your representative is.
Yeah, and those are some really good thoughts there. I kind of think about the point of saying, when we're looking at the issues, saying what is most fair? Are we going with something that properly balances the needs here? And this even goes back a little bit to, I talk a lot about checks and balances on government. But I do feel there are sometimes that there should be a check and balance on the people as well, where as people, we're not unrestrained in everything. We have law. We can't even, I can't vote and say, oh yeah, exclude a Chinese guy from voting. The 15th Amendment prohibits that. There's a check on me as a person, as a representative, if I'm a representative in government, those types of things. But it's not, but we often don't want to believe that there's any check on us and how we operate in relation to government, but I think that there is. And I think there's a lot of instances and examples of that where if you walk into a courtroom, you don't get to say whatever you want to say. You don't get to, just be unruly. You have to follow the rules there. There's a check on you to keep that proceeding, that environment as it needs to be. And if we look at voting is a very important right in America. In a Republican form of government, people need to be able to vote that are properly there in that district, voting for their representatives, like you point out. But if there's no check on us and anyone can say whatever they want, and I can go vote for any name that I can come up with, well, I just go check out Facebook, I walk in, throw out some names and vote. Or maybe I don't even have to say a name, just say, yep, I'm a registered voter. That's all you can check. And in those situations, I think as we're checking even, are you a registered voter or not? Some people might say no, because I don't have a computer, or no, because I couldn't get there on time or whatnot. And we have to ask, did we make it fair for the people to be able to vote? If you said, oh, you have to register within 2 days of turning 18 and you didn't, so therefore you're banned for life. Those types of restrictions wouldn't be fair. They wouldn't strike the balance necessary. And I think as we look at identification for people. The question is, how do we strike the balance? How do we approach these issues? Because again, like you say, Michael, if we create a rule or a check and balance, it will exclude someone. And in some ways, we want it to. We want it to exclude people who aren't supposed to vote. Is there a way to exclude just the people who aren't supposed to vote? Probably not. You know, we don't have those abilities necessarily as a country, unless we're going to go deep into technology, deep into biometrics. A lot of places where people don't want to go with privacy and government. But to share again a little bit as we talk about this balance or this system of checks and balances, we share often talking about liberty is kind of the state, this balance between anarchy and tyranny. Laws are necessary to pull us out of anarchy, and there's some private morality necessary to keep us from tyranny. If you look at voting and voter identification here, if we had no laws surrounding who could vote, then anyone could walk in, like you say, any country could come in, any state could bus a bunch of people over, and it would just kind of be anarchy. Just everyone's voting for everyone. It's a free for all. I voted 5 times. No one stopped me. And so we start to say, well, we don't like that scenario. Let's put some laws in place. And then laws come in place, and then people say, oh, well, there's a law. And because you say driver's licenses, well, that excludes poor people. And poor people, they'll say, are, you know, often more a certain race or a certain skin color or whatnot. And the question then becomes, so let's ask honestly, are we trying to exclude that group or not? Because at some level, we have to have private solutions for sure, morality. The government has to have some level of trust that people who are, you know, who they say they are, it can't be like bulletproof that it's absolutely you and there's no way that someone's defrauding it. But on the flip side, it can't be so loose that anyone can get through as well. And we are trying to strike this balance point. And I like your example of if the law said only people that drink can vote. At some point, I think the courts have to look at that and say, yeah, this isn't equal treatment. There's no rationale, no related connection to drinking and voting. You know, again, America had land ownership as one of the requirements in the past. They've had literacy to say you have to be able to read a certain level. And the literacy one held some sway because it was arguing that if you couldn't read, you wouldn't be informed about who to vote for and about the issues. And so then there is a real question I think that America should ask of who do we want voting? Should you have had to take a government and civics class in order to vote, or should you be able to be completely clueless about everything and vote for, you know, your favorite movie star just because they're running? And in some ways, there's a strong pull for people to say, I should be able to vote for whoever you want. Other people say it greatly undermines the foundations of our country if we're not even educated about these things. But I think in general, if the government's going to impose a requirement, it needs to be a requirement that everybody in America can meet if they want to meet. And what I mean by that is, if it's a literacy test and you have to take a certain class, I would say that the government would have to provide that class free for everybody to take. That anyone should be able to take it, go through and learn the requirements necessary. That if they said, oh, it's only taught at Harvard and only people at a Harvard education have it, to me, that'd be a big issue. So those are kind of examples that talk about the point of kind of boiling down to driver's licenses. If we're going to say you have to have a driver's license in order to come in and vote or some form of government issued photo identification, then I think that one of the underlying questions would have to be, can everyone get one of those? Or are there truly people that for some reason can't get it? And there are some people that live their life and don't ever drive. They may not get a driver's license. But I think it begs the question of, but is there something stopping them from getting a driver's license? If they valued voting enough, even if they don't value driving enough, or they have a medical condition so they can't drive, are they stopped from getting a driver's license? Or is that a reasonable expectation to say, you know, you got to prove that you're this person voting for this representative? And to me, if the means selected are closely related to what we're trying to accomplish with securing voting, and if those means selected are available to every American where they can obtain that, then I think that there should be a lot of deference given to what the state or the local government decides is necessary to prove that you're a registered voter, or to prove that you can vote in those elections. But that's one that we're still debating in America, and there's a big push, and it's interesting to tie this in, because there's a lot of frustration in America over immigration and illegal immigration, a lot of frustration among conservatives who are very upset the federal government's letting people in, they feel, across the border. You know, they're claiming millions of people are coming across the border every year right now. And one of the big concerns is that these people come in and then get a vote, and then they start changing the outcome of elections. And so it's interesting to note that one of the things that the 15th Amendment was trying to do was to get rid of racism, to get rid of these ill feelings being baked into the law. But if we have a system in America that doesn't require any identification, lets illegal citizens, or not illegal citizens, illegal immigrants vote, people who aren't even citizens vote, that is going to create frustration and hostility in people. And so, to me, if we want to get rid of racism in America, we also have to have a fair system that does, I think, protect citizens' rights. Because if I'm a citizen and China just brings over all its people and votes in an election, I'm going to go, hey, China, no, like, stay away, China, because you're diluting my rights now, or North Korea or Russia or any of these. And so it's interesting that we have these debates saying, oh, people are racist that want to impose driver's license requirements. But if we did, it may actually help temper some of the ill feelings that exist, because then there's not as much concern that elections are being diluted or controlled or changed by who can vote in them. So just a random thought to throw out and to think about in connection with how our rules impact the feelings that generate in society. Are our rules, if they're fair, are they generating goodwill towards our fellow men, or are they making us dislike them more? And when I look at that, the voting side compared with the immigration side, I see, I definitely see how a lack of rules or a more anarchy type state could produce a situation where there's increased hostility that we're trying to get past in America. But Michael, curious if you have any final thoughts on voting, or some of what the 15th Amendment talks about.
Yeah, I think that was a great point on how laws can help us in how we treat each other. Because people generally you're going to look to yourself and your family first for well-being, for protection. You want to protect you and your family first. And when you look around and you see things you don't understand, then it's harder to trust. And so if all you see around you is people that you think have taken things away from you, start to treat them differently. It doesn't matter if they did or not. It's a difficult thing to get by. And so having a fairness in laws and the way we vote really helps individuals to look around and say, no, all these people that voted followed the process that we all thought was a pretty fair process. And even if the outcome wasn't what I thought it was, what I wanted it to be, then I can still say, yeah, but I feel like the process was very fair, and it just shows that all these people just disagree with the way I think, and it doesn't feel like it was taken away so much from you as, yeah, you just disagree with those around you. I think that there definitely should be some sort of way to verify that you are who you are and that you have a right to vote under whatever we deem to be. So you're old enough, you're a citizen, or you live in the area that you're voting for, and it really helps it helps to temper down these kinds of contentions among people. And I don't think we should be able to say, because somebody has said there should be a requirement, such as a driver's license, that person is immediately seeking that out because of racism. It's not a fair accusation. It could be, but it's not a definitive outcome of that. Somebody could be just trying to instill the best way they know how of creating a requirement to say, hey, I think only citizens should be able to vote, or whatever the case is. Doesn't make that person racist. When somebody disagrees with you and has a different idea of how they want to instill something, it doesn't make them a bad person. And too often we jump to the extreme. Somebody says, this is the way we should do it, and somebody else disagrees, and instead of saying, I disagree with you, they say, you're a terrible person. And too often this voting conversation turns into that. Well, you want to instill some sort of barrier to voting, that makes you a terrible person. That means you don't want the people you disagree with to vote. And that's just not necessarily true. And I think we need to curtail that back and say, let's have an honest conversation. What are you trying to accomplish? Trying to prevent groups of people from voting based on their skin color? Or are you just trying to find a good way to verify that this person is who they say they are? And maybe there's a better way, and maybe through a polite conversation we can figure out what that is.
Yeah, and I'm certainly very open to hear suggestions on appropriate ways to validate identity, but to me it just seems we'll be in an anarchy type state if we don't validate identity. And it's not fair to let people from another city vote for who's in my city. It's not fair for people from another state vote for who represents me in my state. And so, yeah, I'd say let's, if you don't like a driver's license requirement, let's talk about what could work, what might work. Let's throw out ideas. I love hearing ideas. I love brainstorming, but I don't know how we get past the need to exclude some people, like you say. If I'm in Utah, I don't want Colorado voting for me. And that's just, no offense to Colorado. They don't want me voting for them either. So there has to be some exclusion in these. And it is one of the reasons there's concerns. Utah, conducts their elections solely by mail-in ballots. So they just send a ballot to your house, comes in the mail. Anyone can pick it up. Anyone can intercept it. Anyone can fill it out, sign it, send it back. And so there is a deep issue in Utah of knowing that the actual voter voted on that ballot. There's no way to verify that voter voted. And that's causing some people love the mail-in ballots. They don't care. Other people have some deep concerns over that, going, look, there's so many things that could be happening across the board. Let's get back to this identity-based verification system. And I don't fully know how these issues will play out, but I think the discussions will continue. But I do like your point of saying, let's at least treat each other with respect. We don't have to, throw out accusations that, oh, well, you hate this group or these people or whatever. It's okay to say, hey, did you know that really impacts this group? And explain the reasons why it impacts that group. And to me, it goes back to saying there needs to be a way that everyone, if they want to, can meet that requirement, that's eligible to vote. But if people choose not to, I don't know if it's the government's job to go force them to qualify. There's people that qualify to register to vote, and they don't. We have a lot of people in Utah that are unregistered. And that's their freedom to be unregistered. We don't have to say, oh, we got to choose a different system because some people couldn't go click the 2 buttons online and register. It's very simple to register. Anyone can do it that wants to. If you need help, I'm sure there's resources to help you. And And so, yeah, we don't need to be paternalistic and make sure that everyone does it, because not everyone wants to. And some people choose to vote by not voting and not registering, and that's just the way they live. But I do think, since we're talking about the 15th Amendment and we're talking about trying to eradicate racism, part of that is just general hostility towards our fellow men. We don't need to be angry with each other. People can have ideas and concerns. We can listen to them. And I think people have valid concerns about why imposing a requirement could exclude people. And we should listen and say, it will exclude people, yes, if we put any line in the sand. Is it getting closer and closer to excluding the people we want to exclude? Are we keeping the Utahns out of Colorado? And is there a more fair method proposed? So if you don't like what's proposed, what do you view as more fair? Propose a method. And I would love for people to start to put things out there and go through these options. But ultimately, the 15th Amendment, I think it is pretty taboo to express the reference, any race or culture in voting. So there's not the express references, and we're left fighting over indirect lines and the indirect impact they have on different groups. And we're still, again, working through these things as a nation. But for the most part, there are a lot of changes. There are a lot of groups being represented. Now, is it proportional yet? If you look at the President of the United States, we still haven't had a woman president. And so certainly not everything's completely proportional. But I don't know if we haven't had a woman president, if that fact can be blamed on racism or sexism or, who knows, because women are voting. And they've been voting for about 100 years in America. And why is it that things still play out that way? I don't know. But the systems, the different pieces come into play. Society certainly has some aspect of it. But overall, things can still play out that way without there being express discrimination involved with it. It can just be, it is what it is. Again, this year, there's another 2 candidates for president, most likely, that are male. And why is that? I don't know. But I know a lot of females that aren't voting for the female candidates. And so again, I don't see it as being a discrimination thing per se. That once you get up to a very high level and there's very few people, I don't think it's fair to say, well, that should be proportionate across all of America. There's a lot more factors at play. And so, yeah, so listening, understanding people, and trying to then also propose solutions. If we do see an issue, explain those and have something better that still meets the concerns of the people on the other side that are trying to solve certain problems. So those are some thoughts to chew on as we talk about voting, talk about elections, talk about discrimination, parties in power. I guess one quick question, we won't delve into it much, but just throw it out there. Should it be illegal for the Democrats to discriminate against Republicans or the Republicans to discriminate against Democrats? That's a whole nother can of worms, but something to think about. Yes or no to, and why or why not. But we appreciate you joining us today. We'll continue through these constitutional amendments, go through, talk about them, talk about the different issues, how they may still be in our society or not. And we appreciate you joining us.